Hello again. Today I'm going to take a detour from the normal conversation I have about John chapter 1 and the Logos. And I want to talk about another important verse, which I've been looking at it, studying it for 40 years or so that I've been studying the Bible. And this is a controversial verse that when I look at YouTube videos, I see people talking about this all the time. A lot of Trinitarians bring this verse up because they believe it's conclusive proof that Jesus is God Almighty, and more so that they believe that Jesus is saying that he is God Almighty in this verse. But at the same time, you get the Arian view of the Jehovah's Witnesses, for instance, who they also point to this verse and would use this verse um, as proof of Jesus' pre-existence um, before coming to the earth. Um, so both Trinitarians and Arians look at this verse quite differently. But I wanted to look at it because I constantly read in various Trinitarian books and, as I say, watch Trinitarian videos where people quote this verse and they make the connection with the name of God as revealed in the book of Exodus, which we're going to look at. And what I'm going to look at today is basically to show that that is not the case. That's not a legitimate connection between these two verses. So I thought I'd look at it in a sort of a neutral translation, the King James Bible that I have here. So in John 8:58, Jesus' conversation with the Pharisees, and they're discussing about who he is, what authority does he think he has, and they bring up the comment about Abraham, that they're sons of Abraham. So they get into this conversation, this discussion. And in verse 58, it says, Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. Okay, so that's the expression, I am. And interesting, the King James version, it's not in capitals, it's not capitalized as if it's a title or anything. It's just before Abraham was, I am. And the other verse that the Trinitarians say that this is connected to is, of course, Exodus chapter 3 and verse 14. And in the King James Bible, it reads, And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. And in this verse, they do have I am capitalized as if it's a name or a title. So that's the two verses. And Trinitarians delight in saying that Jesus is here by saying I am to the Pharisees, that he's claiming to be the I am of Exodus 3:14. And of course, in Exodus, it is God speaking, although it's the angel of the Lord is speaking out of the burning bush, and it's effectively it's God that's speaking and calling himself I am. So that's the two passages in question. Now, I want to start with an interesting quote from that I found from James White, who is a very famous Trinitarian who writes several books on the subject and is on the internet, on YouTube, takes part in various debates, the Trinity against Unitarianism. But on this verse, John 8:58, in a book entitled Purpose and Meaning of Ego Eimi in the Gospel of John, he says the following. And of course, ego eimi is the Greek words for I am, that's translated as I am in English. So what does James White say? He says, It is true that many go directly to Exodus 3:14 for the background, but it is felt that unless one first establishes the connection with the direct quotation of ego eimi in the Septuagint, the connection with Exodus 3:14 will be somewhat tenuous. Right? So he mentions the Septuagint. So the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So you need to look at what the Greek Septuagint says there in Exodus 3:14 to see if there's a connection between what Jesus says in the Gospel of John, which is written in Greek. So is there a connection between the Greek of John 8:58 and the Greek of Exodus 3:14 in the Septuagint? So again, he says, unless one first establishes the connection, he says that this would be a somewhat tenuous link. And he also goes on to say it could be fairly admitted that an immediate and unqualified jump from the ego of me of John 8:58 to Exodus 3:14 is unwise. Okay, so unless he says it's an immediate and unqualified, in other words, unless you really know what you're talking about, it's unwise to jump from John 8:58 to 3:14, and that's hopefully what I'm going to demonstrate. So, looking at some comments that I wrote some time ago, I'll just sort of read them to you here from a script I had before. So, what is it about John 8:58 that proves that Jesus is claiming to be God Almighty, Jehovah, or Yahweh? Trinitarians would answer by saying that Jesus claims the title used by Jehovah, Yahweh in Exodus 3:14 being the title I am, or the name I am. First of all, we could look at what the scriptures also say about this phrase I am. And if we turn to Judges chapter 13 and verse 11, Judges chapter 13 verse 11, it's a passage where an angel appears in the guise of a man to Manoah and his wife. And in verse 11, it tells us that Manoah arose and went after his wife and came to the man and said to him, Art thou the man that speakest unto the woman? And he said, I am. If we read the rest of that passage, it basically reveals that this man is actually the angel of the Lord, and that they end up bowing to the ground when the angel ascends back into heaven. They realize they've been speaking to the angel of the Lord and they fear for their lives. But it's interesting that the angel says, I am. It's the same expression. Then if we go to 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 10 into the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 15:10, the words of the Apostle Paul, and he says, But by the grace of God, I am what I am. So he uses the same expression, I am what I am, which sounds very like Exodus 3:14, I am that I am. It's a very close expression in English. And then in Galatians 4 and verse 12, just quickly read that one. Galatians 4 and verse 12, again the Apostle Paul, he says, Brethren, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as you are. So in these three scriptures, we've got the Apostle Paul twice and the angel of the Lord in Judges 13, all saying, I am. So does that mean they're claiming to be Jehovah, claiming to be Yahweh, God Almighty? Well, it's true in English. You could say that they're all saying the same thing in English, but the Trinitarian would reply by saying something to the effect of, yes, but are those three scriptures using a different Greek or Hebrew grammatical term as to the one that's used by Yahweh in Exodus 3:14 and Jesus in John 8:58? Because if they're different grammatical terms, then we couldn't connect them to Exodus 3:14. And they'd be right. because there are different Hebrew and Greek terms that are used, but by which the translator can translate into English as I am. So the point being that just because it says in English I am, it doesn't mean that the underlying Greek or Hebrew is the same as the Hebrew term that's underlying Exodus 3:14. And I'm just going to try and share with you some documents that I have on the computer. So hopefully you'll see this. And I'll just bring up. Just maybe a second. Yeah, so I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully you'll see. Yeah, so this is Exodus 3:14. And if you look at verse 14 here in English, it says, I am that I am. Say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. So the Hebrew expression, if you can see my mouse there, that at the end of the first line of verse 14 in Hebrew, that's the Hebrew word eche, asher, eche. Okay, I am that I am. And then in the last line of the verse, where it repeats the I am, it's the word eche that's repeated. So it's eche, asher, eche, and then eche relating to I am in the last line there. And interestingly, in verse 15, where it says, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, YHVH, the tetragrammaton. And if you look at the second line there, there's the tetragrammaton, Yod He, Vav He, tetragrammaton. So that tetragrammaton relates to the name Jehovah or Yahweh. But in verse 14, I am is Eche Asher Eche. So I'll come out of that page. So that's the Hebrew terms that's there. And in the Greek, it's ego eimi, that is a term found in John 8:58. So this is the point. Does ego eimi equate to the eche asher eche in the Hebrew? And that's what we want to find out. I want to now bring up on screen. It's a Hebrew version of John 8:58. So we've looked at the Hebrew of Exodus 3:14. Now we're looking at a Hebrew interlinear of the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 58, where Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was born, I am. If we look at the Hebrew now, and if we look at the second line, there's the expression ani hayithe. Now, I'm not a Hebrew reader, just know a couple of words to recognize, but that's the Hebrew word ani and hayithe. So it's a completely different expression in Hebrew from the Hebrew expression that's used in Exodus 3:14. So there's, strictly speaking, there's no connection between these two verses in the Hebrew. And I've also got, I'll just stop sharing that screen for a moment. I've also got here the Hebrew English New Testament, which is from the Society for Distributing Hebrew Scriptures from England. And okay, I'll bring it up to the screen. You'll maybe not see it terribly well, but again, so this is a different Hebrew text, but again, it's rather than Ani Hayithi this time, it's got the expression Ani Hu, right? Ani Hu, which is again, still a completely different expression in Hebrew from what the Hebrew of Exodus 3:14 says. So there is no connection in the Hebrew between these two verses. So what about the Greek then? So let's have a look at what the Septuagint has to say about this. So again, I'll just share screen and I'll bring up the Septuagint. So hopefully you can see that. So this is a photocopy from the Septuagint, Exodus 3:14. And again, the verse here, very top. And God spoke to Moses saying, I am the being. Say to the children of Israel, the being has sent me to you. Interesting that it hasn't used the expression I am who I am or what I am. It's saying I am the being. And if we look at the Greek, we see here I've got it underlined in red. That's ego eimi hoon, right? Which means I am the being, or I am the one in Greek. And again, the second part of the verse where it says, the being has sent me to you, the Greek says, hoon. Okay? Now notice that it says, it repeats the hoon. It doesn't repeat the ego eimi. So what does that mean? It means basically that the name here in the Septuagint, the name that most Bibles will translate as I am, the Greek expression that the Septuagint uses is hoon. It's not ego eimi. The ego eimi is just the setup. It's like I am the person you were speaking to yesterday, or I am feeling tired today. The ego eimi is not the name part. It's the hoon that's the name. Okay, so although ego eimi is used here, it's not significant with regards to the name of God in this verse. So just come out of there. So we want to see now what the Greek says in the New Testament. So again, I'll share my screen. And we should have John 8:58 here in the Greek. So truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. So the expression there is ego eimi. Whereas we saw it in the Septuagint, the expression in full was ego eimi hoon, and the name part with the repetition is Greek hoon. But here in the interlinear reading, there's no hoon. It's only ego eimi. So we can see that the expression here is not the same as that used in the Septuagint for Exodus 3:14. If the Bible writer was going to show the connection between Jesus' words and Exodus 3:14, he would have had to have said the full expression ego eimi hoon, or simply hoon, not ego eimi on its own. So we can see from both looking at a Hebrew translation of the New Testament and looking at the New Testament Greek, we can see both expressions that are used in the New Testament do not match the Hebrew Masoretic text or the Septuagint Greek text for Exodus 3:14. So the Hebrew expression anihu and the Greek expression ego eimi in the New Testament do not match the Hebrew eche asha eche or the Greek ego eimi hoon for Exodus 3:14. So as James White had correctly said, that unless one first establishes the connection with the direct quotation of ego eimi in the Septuagint, the connection with Exodus 3:14 will be somewhat tenuous. And he says, and also unwise. Well, I would say not only is it tenuous and unwise, I would say it's totally unwarranted, that there is no connection in either the Greek or Hebrew between these two verses. Now, it's to finalize, I'll just say that the Greek expression ego me, what does it mean then? Being translated as I am, what was Jesus talking about? Well, this is a huge subject, and I can't go into all of this in this first video. I'm planning to maybe do another two, maybe even three videos to fully explore this passage, what it's getting at, what it really means. But just as a way of a starter on that point, I'll just highlight Raymond Brown's book, An Introduction to New Testament Christology. Now, he's got a lot to say about this expression, which I won't go into all of it today, but I'll just say that on page 137, he makes the point that a particular facet of Johannine pre-creational Christology appears in the use of I am by Jesus. The corresponding Greek ego eimi can be simply a phrase of common speech, equivalent to saying, it is I, or I am the one. Or even in the footnote, it makes the point, even I am he. Right? That's how it could be translated into English. Ego me. So that's his thought on that. And I thought I would just read to you a few different translations on this. So this is an old translation, the 20th century New Testament. And in John 8:58, how does it render this verse? It says, in truth, I tell you, replied Jesus, before Abraham existed, I was. Okay, not I am, but I was. So that's another take on it. In James Moffat's translation, John 8:58, get the right verse. John 8:58. He says, truly, truly, I tell you, said Jesus, I have existed before Abraham was born. So there's no I am at all in that verse either. He says, I tell you, I have existed before Abraham was born. Okay, so that verse tends to suggest pre-existence on the part of Jesus, and that's why Jehovah's Witnesses use that translation. But it doesn't say I am, and this is the point that an English translation of John 8:58 doesn't have to use the English term I am. It's perfectly acceptable to render it as I was, or I existed before. So it doesn't have to be translated as I am. It's generally only translated as I am when a translator in a Bible is trying to make a connection to Exodus 3:14. But what does ego eimi tell us about Jesus? We'll just look at a few verses in the scriptures in the New Testament. If we were to look at John 4:26, it's the conversation of Jesus with the Samaritan woman. And in verse, get it here, in verse 26, we'll look at we'll start with King James again. John 4:26. The woman saith, in verse 25, the woman saith unto him, I know that Messiah is cometh, which is called Christ. When he is come, he will tell us all things. And then in verse 26, Jesus saith unto her, I that speak unto thee am he. Okay, the expression there is ego me, but here it's now translated not as I am, but am he. Okay, so that's the King James version. In let's see, the New English Bible, we'll look at John 4:26. Verse 26, Jesus said, I am he who am speaking to you now. So it translates ego me as I am he. Okay. So they were talking about the Messiah coming, and Jesus is saying to the woman, ego me, I am that one we're speaking about. This is another translation, easy to read version. And in John 4:25 and 26, it renders it as the woman said, I know that the Messiah is coming. Messiah is the one called Christ. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. Now, notice how this easy to read version translates ego me in this verse 26. Then Jesus said, he is talking to you now. I'm the Messiah. Okay, now in the Greek, if we were to look at the Greek, it just simply says ego me. It doesn't use the Christos in Greek for Messiah. It doesn't say that. It says ego me. It's making the point that it's filling out the meaning of the expression here. He's basically saying that he's the Messiah when he says ego me. And if we look at one more verse on this point, Mark chapter 13 and verse 6, talking about the sign on the Mount of Olives when he's speaking to Peter, James, John, and Andrew. They're saying, tell us when will these things happen. Now, in verse 5 in the Mark 13 account, Jesus began, I take care that no one misleads you. Many will come claiming my name and saying, I am he. Now, again, if we look at the Greek, it simply says ego me. Many will come in my name saying ego me. So is Jesus saying here that many will come saying that they are God? Many will come saying that they are Yahweh? Or just coming saying that they are the Christ, the Messiah? So that's Mark chapter 13. And if we look at some other translations, we'll see how they translate this. So going back to the easy to read version, Mark 13 and verse 6, this version says, many people will come and use my name. They will say, I am the one, and will fool many people. So again, the Greek the Greek term is just simply ego me. They translate it as I am the one. That's his name that they're going to come claiming. And if you get a Greek English interlinear like Benjamin Wilson's emphatic dialogue, you can check the verse in Greek. And in verse 6, it just simply says ego me in Mark 13. But if we now turn to Matthew 24, which is the parallel account, Matthew 24, and verse 5, Matthew's account, the very same situation, is it? The very same account. His version says, take care that no one misleads you, for many will come claiming my name and saying, I am the Messiah. And if we check the Greek and the interlinear, this time in Matthew, the Greek does have the Greek term Christos, ego eimi ho Christos. So I am the Christ, or I am the Messiah. So from Mark's account, he just uses ego eimi. In the Matthew account, the exact same situation, exact same occurrence, he fills out and gives that extra meaning, so that when Mark says, Jesus says, ones will come saying ego eimi, Matthew's telling us that that ego eimi means the Messiah. Okay, so the point is that when Jesus uses the Greek expression ego eimi, he's not claiming the name of God from Exodus 3:14. But in fact, as this comparison of different New Testament translations, we can see that the Greek term ego eimi can simply mean I am he, I am the one, I am the Messiah. So is that what Jesus was talking about in John 8:58 when he said, before Abraham was, I am? Was he saying that I am the one, I am the Messiah? Okay, so that's the follow-up for the next video. We'll look at more of the passage in John 8, the context. We'll look at the various uses of I am, ego, me that's used there, and we'll look at the background of it and dig deeper into this expression and what Jesus was referring to in this passage, and see what how the Pharisees misunderstood what he said, and in fact how Trinitarians misunderstand this whole passage. So I hope that's been of help, and so hopefully you'll join me next time to see what I'm going to say further on this. If you've liked this video and you want to see the next one, please press the like button, subscribe if you haven't already done so, and thanks for listening, and see you hopefully next time. Bye for now.